For years, Moscow believed war was a distant storm, something that thundered only on foreign soil, beyond the borders of the motherland. On Russian television, it was described as a special military operation, sterilized by propaganda and muted by censorship. Explosions were events that happened in places with unfamiliar names: Donetsk, Kharkiv, Mariupol, never Moscow. But on the night of October 21, 2025, the illusion shattered. As air raid sirens howled across the capital for the first time since World War II, millions of Muscovites realized the war had finally come home. What was once televised became tangible. Fire in the sky, the hum of engines, and the terrifying crack of explosions echoing through the suburbs. That night marked the most intense missile barrage Russia had suffered since the invasion began. The nation's armor, its faith in security, stability, and the Kremlin's untouchable image, fractured in an instant. The targets were not random. They were the arteries of the Russian war machine, the Bryansk chemical plant and the Saransk mechanical works, both critical to ammunition and rocket fuel production. These factories weren't just military assets. They were the beating hearts of entire cities. For decades, these monogorods, or single-factory towns, kept tens of thousands of Russians employed, fed, and loyal. The destruction of those plants was not only a strategic strike, it was a social and psychological earthquake. As fire engulfed Bryansk, satellite feeds captured plumes of smoke spiraling into the night sky, stretching for miles. In Saransk, the impact was equally catastrophic. A series of detonations tearing through reinforced bunkers and production halls. The roar of the Storm Shadow and Peklo missiles cut through the Russian night like thunder from a new age of warfare. By morning, telegram channels across Russia were flooded with panic. Factory workers uploaded photos of the devastation. "Our factory is gone," one post read. Another pleaded, "Who will feed us now? Winter is coming." These weren't dissidents. They were loyal citizens, the silent supporters of Vladimir Putin's regime. And in a single night, their faith turned to fear. Economists now estimate up to 85,000 livelihoods vanished overnight, collapsing the fragile ecosystem of two entire regions. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. Power plants in Smolensk and Bryansk were hit. Fuel refineries in Dagestan burned. Moscow's skyline flickered as air defense batteries tried to contain the storm. The Kremlin's great promise, stability in exchange for obedience, was reduced to ash. Putin's social contract had been rewritten by fire. The capital that once believed itself invincible now trembled under the glow of its own burning reflection. To understand the scale of what unfolded between October 21st and 22nd, 2025, we must dive beneath the smoke into the anatomy of the strike itself. What Ukraine executed that night wasn't just a missile attack. It was a multi-layered strategic operation, the culmination of months of intelligence gathering, electronic warfare, and psychological preparation. For weeks prior, Ukraine's military intelligence service, KUAR, had been mapping every inch of the Russian industrial belt using satellite reconnaissance and deep infiltration of civilian communication channels. Thousands of low-cost drones acted as eyes in the sky, charting radar patterns, power grids, and logistical hubs. Once the network was mapped, Kiev's planners designed an operation to blind, deafen, and overload Russia's air defense. When the night arrived, hundreds of unmanned aerial vehicles, some carrying explosives, others acting as decoys, surged across Russian airspace. They came in waves, deliberately spaced to confuse radar and force operators to waste their expensive Pantsir and S-400 missiles on $500 targets. As Russian crews scrambled to identify real threats, the main strike package slipped through the chaos. A deadly orchestra of Storm Shadow, Skal-PG, Peklo, and Flamingo cruise missiles. Each missile was guided with surgical precision. Flying at treetop height, using terrain-following radar and infrared targeting, they bypassed electronic jamming entirely. When they reached Bryansk, they struck the chemical complex at its most critical points. the underground bunkers where solid rocket fuel and gunpowder were stored. The explosion that followed wasn't just massive, it was transformational. The blast consumed entire production blocks, sending shock waves through Russia's supply lines. The flames were visible from 40 kilometers away. In Saransk, 670 kilometers from Ukraine's border, another strike tore through the mechanical plant responsible for precision-engineered gyroscopes and missile casings. These weren't replaceable factories. Their machinery, imported decades ago from Japan and Germany, operated at tolerances of 1/10,000th of a centimeter. With those machines destroyed, an entire generation of Russian weapons production vanished in minutes. Even the Dagnotech refinery in Dagestan, 2,200 kilometers from the front, wasn't spared. A single missile hit a crucial pipeline junction, igniting a fireball that paralyzed the Caspian Fleet's fuel supply. Every warship, radar base, and convoy in southern Russia depended on that flow. Overnight, it went dark. This was not random destruction, it was a decapitation strike. Ukraine had turned the heart of Russia's industrial economy into a battlefield without ever crossing the border. What's more, it revealed a terrifying new truth. Russia's strategic depth no longer exists. For the Kremlin, this was more than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological implosion. Moscow's invisible armor was pierced, and the myth of an invulnerable fortress was gone forever. When the smoke cleared, Russia faced a grim new reality, one that no propaganda could disguise. The explosions in Bryansk and Saransk didn't just cripple production lines, they detonated the very foundation of Russia's social contract. For decades, the unwritten rule was simple. Citizens remained loyal and silent, and in return, the Kremlin provided stability, steady wages, heating in winter, and the illusion of safety. That contract was reduced to ashes on October 21, 2025. Tens of thousands of workers woke up to unemployment, freezing homes, and empty promises. Telegram channels that once echoed patriotic slogans were now filled with desperation. One worker wrote, "We have no money. The plant is gone. The government lies." Another message read, "Our sons fight in Ukraine, and our fathers starve here." The fallout rippled far beyond the factory towns. In Moscow's elite suburbs, the capital's wealthy class finally heard the same sirens that had haunted Ukrainian cities for years. For the first time since World War II, Muscovites huddled in metro stations as air defense shrapnel rained from the sky. The myth of the invincible capital had collapsed. Strategically, the consequences were devastating. The destruction of Bryansk's chemical facilities meant Russia's rocket artillery systems, Grad, Smerch, and Tornado, would soon run out of fuel propellant. Without gunpowder production, even basic ammunition lines were interrupted. Every shell fired on the front would now drain from a finite and unreplenishable stockpile. Economically, the blow was catastrophic. Analysts estimated that the combined loss of Bryansk and Saransk erased billions of rubles in industrial capacity, not to mention cascading secondary effects from logistics companies to local merchants. But the deeper consequence was psychological. The regime's aura of invulnerability was gone. And when authoritarian regimes lose that aura, fear begins to fade, replaced by resentment. By the end of October, satellite imagery showed thousands of people leaving Bryansk and Saransk, searching for work in other regions. Entire communities were hollowed out overnight. Russia was not only losing territory at the front, it was losing its home front. Ukraine had achieved something extraordinary. It merged two previously separate worlds, the front line and the factory line. For the first time, the war that Russia waged abroad had returned home in the form of economic collapse, hunger, and rage. The question now was simple. If the Kremlin could not protect its own workers, how long would those workers continue to protect the Kremlin? The Kremlin's immediate reaction was denial. Within hours of the strikes, regional governors issued identical statements: "No damage, situation under control." Yet satellite images told another story. Entire factory complexes wiped from existence. Videos posted by locals flooded the internet faster than censorship could erase them. The Russian state's most powerful weapon, control of the narrative, had failed. Unable to retaliate symmetrically against Ukraine's fortified military infrastructure, Putin turned to what he knew best: terror through escalation. In the early hours of October 22nd, Russia launched a massive retaliation using over 400 Geran-2 drones and a series of Kinzhal and Iskander missiles, targeting Ukrainian power plants and heating stations. Kyiv went dark, but it was a hollow victory. Destroying Ukraine's energy grid could not bring back the destroyed factories of Bryansk. It was vengeance, not strategy. Inside the Kremlin, analysts faced an impossible equation. Rebuilding Bryansk or Saransk's production capacity would require high-precision European machinery, specialized alloys from Japan, and complex control systems, all inaccessible under sanctions. Chinese substitutes, already tested in other defense sectors, lacked the required accuracy. Even if reconstruction began immediately, it would take years, and Ukraine could strike again at any moment. In short, Russia's industrial backbone was broken beyond repair. This realization sparked quiet panic within the Kremlin's inner circle. Oligarchs began quietly moving funds abroad, fearing that the next blow could be financial, not military. Meanwhile, mid-level officials were caught between loyalty and survival, watching a regime losing both its resources and the obedience of its people. Ukraine, on the other hand, showcased a new kind of asymmetric warfare, one built on intelligence, precision, and economic attrition rather than sheer force. By targeting the industrial arteries that fed the Russian army, it forced Moscow to choose: feed the war or feed its people. The responses within Russia reflected a nation in denial. State television avoided showing destroyed factories, instead airing patriotic songs and old war footage. But the internet told another story. Videos of burning plants, crying workers, and empty cities became symbols of betrayal. The Kremlin's greatest enemy was no longer the West. It was the truth itself. October 21st to 22nd, 2025, a date already etched into Russian history, marks not a battle lost, but an empire exposed. The myth of invincibility that Vladimir Putin spent 2 decades building collapsed in less than 48 hours. The strikes on Bryansk, Saransk, and Dagestan weren't just explosions, they were the visible cracks in the Kremlin's illusion of eternal control. For ordinary Russians, this was the night the truth arrived in fire. They learned that their leaders had built their livelihoods on powder kegs, factories turned into human shields, cities tied to weapons production, lives mortgaged to sustain a war they never chose. The war had finally come full circle. The sound of missiles over Moscow wasn't just the end of an illusion, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Strategically, Ukraine proved it could reach anywhere, from Moscow's suburbs to the Caspian coast. Militarily, it shattered Russia's logistics and exposed its air defense vulnerabilities. Economically, it erased years of industrial output. But politically, it did something far greater. It broke fear. When fear collapses, regimes follow. Across Russia, whispers of betrayal are growing louder. Workers no longer trust their governors. Governors no longer trust Moscow. And the elite, once untouchable, now look over their shoulders as the war they financed devours their own empire. For Putin, there are no good moves left. Rebuild and risk another strike, or retreat and admit defeat. Every choice leads to erosion, of power, of faith, of the myth that Russia stands unbreakable. As night falls again over Moscow, the city's lights shimmer through a thin haze of smoke. The people who once ignored the war now live within it. Ukraine has proven that war is no longer a distant frontier. It's a mirror held up to those who started it. And as the Kremlin's walls echo with silence, one truth remains undeniable. Empires rarely fall in a single battle, but always in a single moment of disbelief. The government spoke of distant battles and decisive victories,